This is my dad. So my father was not only a survivor of the Holocaust, but he was also a professor at a university. And he attained that. It was a pretty amazing story, and I'll share that years old. So you may be able to relate to his story in some way. He was taken by the Nazis at that age, and he was 17 at the end of the war. This means that he did not get to finish high school. And this affected him greatly, but still, he became a professor. So his story is remarkable in that he had to come out of that country in order to achieve those things to a country which is this one, where he didn't know the language, he didn't have high school education, his family was no longer, they had been killed, and he didn't have any money. This might be familiar to some of you because I know that Malden, and I live here, is a city of immigrants, and so we might be very familiar with some of these stories. So my father passed away in 2010. I'm sorry that he is no longer here. He and I used to speak together, and after he passed away, I felt that it was important to continue to share his story. And fortunately, my mom is able to come with me. And so she and my father lived together for 54 years. She knows his story very well as well. So this is our family. So that's my mom and my dad and my two brothers and me. I was 9 years old in this picture, and after 9/11. And the things that changed after 9/11, and you guys were just young at the time when it happened, but people started to look at each other differently, and people started to have less trust. And then there was more probing of people at the airport, and it was harder to travel. Also, when the Holocaust happened, a lot of things shifted in terms of trust. Nobody believed that it could happen. Nobody believed that in an industrialized nation that the Holocaust could occur, but it did. So that was one thing. The other thing that I was very much aware of when I learned was I would not have been born if my father hadn't survived. And I felt that there was something important about that. I didn't know at age 9. That's when I learned about that I had lost my entire family on my father's side. I didn't know what it would do for me, but I did know that there was something that had to be communicated and done, I thought, because I learned this piece of information. I thought I was going to learn the languages of the world and create world peace. I didn't achieve that. But anyway, that was my dream. This is my father when he was 2. So I'm going to be showing you photos and telling you about his life until the Holocaust occurred, and then he's going to tell his story in a little bit, and then after that I'm going to talk about when he's here in the United States and what happened here. So life was pretty normal at that point in 1930. The war didn't start until 1938. And I don't know if you guys, it's U.S. history you're studying, but so in Hungary, which is where my father was from, the war didn't come into Hungary until just before the end of the war. So it was 1944 when the Nazis came into Hungary. The war was over in 1945. So the Jewish people in Hungary thought that they were safe. And that was because, and my father will say in his video, that there was an alliance between Hungary and the Germans. And so they thought that the Jewish people thought they were protected. But it wasn't the case, as you know through history. So the way things happened in Hungary was it started out seemingly slowly, and through the entire the Holocaust from 1938, seemingly slowly. But it was planned. It was a systematic plan. And so the German Nazis knew what they were doing. But here's something very important. You know how if there's anything that you find out about, all you have to do is check your phone, look on the internet, and you can easily find something out. People will reveal it in one way or another. Snapchat, Instagram, doesn't matter. They didn't have any of that. There was no way for people to communicate that way. So the only thing you could do was wait for a radio broadcast, read in the newspaper, but the government was in control of that. So they didn't have control the way we have control over our own information. Of course, we have misinformation through that way as well, but because we are now able to communicate, it's much more difficult for something to happen on a major level and we wouldn't know anything about it. So that's a very key thing to know about it, and to realize that that's one of the ways that the Holocaust could have happened, because people didn't know. They never, ever imagined that something like that would happen. And so the way that the Nazis did it was very slowly, systematically, step by step. And one of the main ways is that they took rights away from people. And another main way is they isolated people. So you probably read about or heard about ghettos. And so ghettos was one of the ways of isolating people. But first, before they ghettoized them, they had to know who was supposed to go into that ghetto. So I'll get into that a little bit later. So this is this is Hungary. It's in Eastern Europe. Some people say some people say Central Europe. So Eastern or Central Europe. And Miskolc is up at the top, near Slovakia. Miskolc was, at that time, and still is, the second or third largest city in Hungary. So it's not a little village. It's kind of a metropolitan, sort of like Malden. There's a lot going on. You can get into the city fairly easily. Budapest was here. They had the rail system. Not too many people had cars at that time. And they didn't have a reason to go out of the city like we often go into the city. But things were happening there. And they had all the modern conveniences that not that we have here, but that anyone would have at that time. So Miskolc's population, I'm going to show you a picture of it, was nearly 200,000 people at that time. It was 100,000 people at that time. And the Jewish population was about 20% of that. But today, the Miskolc population, where my father was born, is double that. And the Jewish population is only 30 to 50 people. Now, how is that? How is it possible to have such a reduction of people? So, people were killed, as you know, but people like my father, who survived, they realized, after some time, there's nothing here for me. So not only did the family not come back, and the friends didn't come back. So remember, he was only 17 years old. He needed somebody. But in addition, there was rampant anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism is sort of like racism, except it's directed at Jews. What it is hatred. It's hatred against a group for no reason other than to hate. And so, as we know, hatred for its own sake has absolutely no value for anyone in society, and it only harms. And it feeds on itself. So when some people hate, other people hate as well. So it has to be stemmed. But at that time, that was not part of the consciousness. People were not woke, as we say. So instead, they just fed on that hatred. And so for my father, he realized that not having money or family and the anti-Semitism, he had to leave. He didn't know where he was going to go, but he had to get out. So that is one of the reasons that the population was so small. That's a picture of the same thing that I just mentioned. So this is my dad with his parents. And so even though at this time, in 1938, it was kind of changing from a normal life, the Jews were starting to become scapegoats. Now, throughout history, Jews have been scapegoats. You might know about this. And some people blame the Jews for everything from the point of Jesus' death until now, and there's lots of things in history that have happened. And again, I maintain this is to have a scapegoat. Again, just a point of hatred. And I don't see any benefit to blaming a particular group for anything at all. So one of the things that the Jews were blamed for was the First World War. I don't know if you guys have studied about that. So the Germans lost, and they blamed the Jews. And what developed after this systematic changes was that an institutional killing factor, which you may or may not have studied about because you're focused on the U.S. side of things. But yeah,
we are hearing some, and they also saw it. They read night.
Okay.
And they have.
So there were different ways of the killing. One was death camps, and another was labor camps. My father was in a labor camp, but most of his family were killed in Auschwitz, which was one of the major death camps. There are other ways also that people survived, and one is through hiding, and another is through fighting back. But I'm not sharing those parts of the story here. And one of the other things is through mass transport. So they transported the Jews. Once they had identified and isolated them, then they transported them to where they wanted the killing to take place. So from that point, we'll go to something a little bit lighter. So this is my dad. It's not really my dad's dog. This is actually the dog that I grew up with. And this dog, it looks very much like the dog that my dad grew up with. And the reason I'm sharing this with you is to share a point of hope out of this dismal story, a point of hope. So my father loved animals, and I'm going to give you a metaphor in a little bit about how his love of animals also will remind us of how his own life was saved. So I'll show you how that is. So this is the elementary school that my father went to. And next to the elementary school was a river. You might not be able to see that well, but anyway, so there's a river. And during that time, if there was an animal that wasn't wanted, they didn't call the dog catcher. There wasn't such a thing as that, or cat catcher. They would throw kittens into the river to drown. And I know you may be saying, how horrible. And that is exactly what my father and his best friend Tommy thought as well. And so what they did was they rescued them. So this is the metaphor. His life was also rescued. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here to tell you his story. He studied very hard in elementary school, and he got to go to, so just back up for a second. This is a Jewish elementary school. So it was a Jewish elementary school. It was co-ed. And then when he went to high school, it was a Catholic school or a Protestant school. So if you studied very hard, only a few, and this is only for the boys, like 6 boys were able to get into the Catholic school. It was a better school, kind of like an exam school. And so because he studied very hard, he got to do it. This actually helped him a great deal in his life. Because the fact that he could study hard helped him to be able to become the professor that he did, even though he was fighting against so many odds within himself. When he was 13 years old, he and his best friend Tommy had their bar mitzvahs. You may or may not know what a bar mitzvah is. It's a coming-of-age ceremony for Jewish boys back then. Now today we also have bat mitzvah for girls, but back then there was no such thing for girls. So in today's world, if you've ever been to a bar or bat mitzvah, the person who is having the bar bat mitzvah will read from the Bible, which is, we call it Torah, and it's in Hebrew without vowels. It's very difficult, and they have to sing, they have to chant. So they did a similar thing back then, but today you have a party. It's a big time party. Back then, they drank a little wine and they got some present, which was for Tommy and my dad, bicycle, which was big. It was a really huge thing. And because they had the bicycle, it gave them mobility. And this mobility, I'm going to show you later on, gave them some freedom. The other thing that they did was, at this point, there was a movement called the Nazi Youth. And the Nazi youth was not only in Germany, it was moving, as I mentioned, anti-Semitism was also rampant in Hungary and all the other areas where the Nazis were moving into. And so Tommy and my dad would protect the younger and the weaker kids from getting harmed by the Nazis. They also had some fun. So where they would socialize was at the synagogue. So they socialized with kids who were of their same ethnic background. Today we're very integrated, but back then things were much more segregated. And the reason for that was safety. I mean, I think that's still true in certain ways, like, not Malden, I don't think, but in many high schools, kids who are of a certain group will go sit in the cafeteria with those same kids of the same ethnic group. It's comfort, it's trust. So that was the reason that kids got together with other kids at the synagogue. Their whole lives were focused there, outside of school. And so they would have dances with the kids who they knew from the synagogue. They would take dancing lessons. The dances were not at the synagogues, they were in the homes of the parents. And so they would have that as one of their activities. This is the synagogue, and this is my dad's maternal mom, his mother's mom. The reason I'm showing you these two pictures together is to let you know about the proximity. So my great-grandmother lived in the same vicinity as the synagogue. And what that area became was the ghetto. So I know that you guys understand the difference between ghetto today and what ghetto meant back then. So ghetto today is an economic reason, and it's not a choice in a sense, because if you're born into an economic class, it's hard to move out, but you can move out, and it's long-term. But back then, ghetto was for a short period of time for a purpose. People were identified, and they were put into the ghetto for a purpose, to move them someplace. So it was a decision by the government for that reason. Now, my family did go into the ghetto, but my grandfather did not. So there was a rule at this time that men of working age were expected to work, but they weren't paid. So he was essentially a slave laborer. He was required to work for the German government at that time, and then it became for the Nazis. My father, on the other hand, was in the ghetto. Now, this is not really my father. I Googled Miskolc bicycle, and I found this, and I said, my father could have done that, I bet. He was a pretty daring kind of guy. So the story I want to tell you about the bicycles, I told you it gave him freedom. He got a job. So the job was to be a messenger for the hospital. Now, you might say, wow, there was a hospital in the ghetto? They turned the synagogue into a hospital. It wasn't really a hospital. People in close quarters get sick from each other. And so they had to have some place to treat them. That was the synagogue, which was the hospital. And at that hospital, all the people who were really medical people, like doctors, all those folks, they worked in the synagogue, which was the hospital. So one day, my father is living in the ghetto with all his whole family, like grandparents, everybody, in one house. That same grandmother who I showed you. And one day, a doctor from the hospital comes to the door, and he says, I have a job for you. So, I'm not sure if I mentioned to you. So my father had the job of being a messenger with the bicycle. So the doctor comes to the house, and he says, I have a job for you. And somehow he knew that his sister was going to be interrogated, questioned by the Nazis. Now, I don't know how he knew that, and we never found out how he knew that. My father never knew that. But because the doctor came to him and said that, then he said, I need you to do something to save my sister. His sister was pregnant. And so he thought that his sister would be killed. He said, I have this pill, and I want you to give this pill to my sister. And it's not going to kill her. It's going to slow down her heart rate so that it will look like she's dead, unless somebody is a medical professional, has a stethoscope. And okay. And so my father was afraid because he was only 16 and he didn't want to kill the doctor's sister, but it was a grown-up and it was a doctor, so he did it. And it turned out that the sister survived. And so it's a story of how people helped one another. It was a kind of desperate situation back then, but how they were able to help one another. It was a few months after they went into the ghetto, this was 1944, my father was 16, that the ghetto was liquidated. So liquidated meant forced out. And so at that time, they had, like in the center of Malden, you can imagine like right over by, you know, when we have the Memorial Day parade and there's a table in the center of Malden and Mayor Christensen is up on the bandstand. It wasn't a table that high, but like that. People would walk up to a table, probably just, you know, height of your waist. And so there was a guard sitting at that table. And this was the policy. Everyone from the ghetto had to stand in line and talk to the guard. Now, the guard spoke two languages, really helpful. He spoke Hungarian, which is not like any other language in the world except Finnish, very distantly. And he also spoke German. So the guard, behind the guard, was a German Nazi. And the German Nazi did not speak Hungarian. Again, it's a very difficult language. He only spoke German. And so he didn't understand what was being said in Hungarian. It had to be translated for him. It's an advantage. So people would walk up to the guard, and they would say, and the guard would say to them, "How old are you?" Now nobody knew why this question was being asked. You guys may or may not know this. Well, so there's a rule.
Liquidated. My mother, both of my grandmothers, my grandfather, and my aunt, and more than 500,000 other Hungarian Jews were transported to Auschwitz. My father and I, we were taken by the Hungarian military for forced labor. For 6 months, we performed a whole variety of tasks. We worked in a coal mine, road construction, gathered the harvest, worked in forestry, and cleared snow. And in December 1944, the Hungarians turned us over to the Germans for deportation to the Neuhaus, the labor camp in Austria, to dig ditches and tank traps. Although we were in there for less than 4 months, only a few of us survived. Exhausted from hunger and frostbite, we agreed the Spital, the hospital. No one ever returned. You can imagine my despair when my father developed a high fever, the dreaded sign of typhus. He couldn't eat and even threw up the moldy bread that made up most of our diet. I was desperate to get him medicine to reduce his fever and get him some edible food. One night, I managed to sneak out. This was possible because my house collections for the hospital until the end, but eventually
So as I promised you, just a few more slides because you've been very patient and paying good attention, and I want you to have an opportunity to talk and ask whatever questions you might have. So this is my dad. Just before he came to the United States, so the war was over in 1945. He came here in 1949, actually. And my parents, this is their wedding day, and they graduated together. My father ended up, just to say it briefly, coming to Florida. That's where he emigrated. He had an uncle who sponsored him, and then the uncle said, 2 weeks, that's enough for you. You got to find your own place. You got to find a job. He didn't know any English, so he had to start from scratch. He did end up going to college, which he did end up finishing high school, which was actually a GED, not the same thing as high school diploma. He did end up going to college. He went to college in New York. City College of New York at that time was free. It was called Poor Man's Harvard. And they had a great education for free. they did not want to let him in. And they said, you don't have a regular high school diploma, and we don't know, you don't have a transcript, you don't know how we can verify anything about you. It's too much of a risk. And he kept going back. And finally they said, all right, we'll give you a chance. And he graduated first in his class of 2000, which was like, I'm so proud of my father. He dedicated himself to education. I mean, that was what he taught us, how important education is. He knew 4 languages. He authored books. He was a full professor, and he went to Harvard after he graduated from the City College of New York for graduate school. So, and he started an honor society for economics, which was his field. It didn't exist, or sort of antiquatedly existed. So he did quite a lot in his life. So his life was good after the horrors. This is Rosa Schreiber, and she actually was another amazing, she was an inspiration for all of us. We didn't really appreciate her when we were growing up. When we were teenagers, we were like, who's this? She came once or twice to visit, but when you think about it, she didn't know any English, and she came by herself, and she was legally blind, and she traveled by herself. She was in her 80s. So she was really an amazing woman. So sometimes when you're in your teens, you don't really recognize it, and later you're like, wow, look at that. I didn't know how important or how valuable that is. But she risked her life with the Nazis. She did things, and she not only saved my father's life. My father learned that she never would have gotten that award if other people hadn't come forward. So he found some documents, as he mentioned in the video. I know there was like a lot in that video. But he found documents to prove that other people knew that she had saved their lives, or had reported that she had saved their lives. She got some mention through her government in Austria. And so he was able to get that award for her. So she regularly would stand up to the Nazis. I mean, who does that? It's an incredible thing. And this is my family. That's Netta. That's Netta. So Netta was 5 years old with her sister, who's now in 6th grade at Linden, that's her, came, and she was adopted from Guatemala. So we're truly an international family. And my father and I used to talk together, as I mentioned. Well, guys carry, and your muscles are affected, so he wasn't able to talk, but I felt it was important to tell his story for him. And that's my dad. At Meg's preschool graduation. So that was 2005. So that's the end of my talk. I do have, if you don't have any questions, I have questions for you, but I think you might have some questions. You might have come up with some of those with Ms. Healy, or was it also in a box? There was a box of photos that was kept? Is that it? Oh, wow. So we got to have those from my father's uncle, and his daughter saved them and gave them to our family. We're so grateful for it. And then the other pictures, like the synagogue, there's actually a book about Miskolc Ghetto. It was written, my father was interviewed for it. I'm trying to remember all those details about it. But it had those pictures in the synagogue, the elementary school, the Catholic high school, So I don't remember the details on that, but we have that book at home, and so I just scanned those pictures. It was awesome.
I'm wondering if your father got to make the trip back to Miskolc later on.
Oh, yeah.
Was that possible? Did you guys go?
Yeah, so we went as a family. But before we went as a family, my father's specialty in economics was east-west trade, so he would go back and forth. And that was really hard for him. He didn't go to Miskolc. The first time we went to Miskolc was 50 years after the war. So now it's 70 years after the war, 72 actually to be exact. So this was 22 years ago that we went. So it was my parents, when my dad was alive. It was 1995. My mom was much better health. And my wife, Ginny, and I went. The 4 of us went. It was like a trip. We spent 3 weeks, and we went to Budapest, which is the capital. We went to Miskolc. So we saw the city, and that was so eye-opening in so many ways. imagine you go back to the city where you grew up, you hadn't been there in 50 years, and the street is gone. It was quite like a mind-blowing. We went to Vienna, we went to Auschwitz. Auschwitz was incredibly difficult, and I remember saying to my dad, how are you coping with this? Because his whole family was killed there. And he said, I put it in another compartment. So that's how he managed. Just like put it someplace else in his mind, like it's not in the front. I remember the thing that struck me most about Miskolc was they had a lake there, and the lake was gray, and that's where they dumped the ashes of the people. And I thought, oh my God, that's my grandmother's grave. I mean, like that's where I was with that at that 1995. It was so shocking to me. It was really great to be with my father had one cousin who survived in Hungary, and then he had a wife and kids, so we had family there, and that was really great. So I was teaching English as a second language at the time, and my cousin was an ESL teacher, and so I taught a class in Hungary.